Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in. You probably came here looking to watch me rank all the games I reviewed in 2024. Well, that's exactly what I'm about to do. I did this last year, but obviously I've reviewed more games since last year, so I'm gonna do it again. I don't often compare and contrast between games, so this is my way of figuring out how they all stack up against each other, and also praising or shitting on these games a second time. I'm once again going to do this in the form of a tier list because that's something that everyone can wrap their heads around. Last time I gave the tiers stupid names. This time I'm going to do something more refined and appropriate, basing the names on phrases you hear in the realm of love. The highest tier is going to be called Will You Marry Me, for the games that I love the most. Beneath that is Wanna Go on a Date, for the games that I love, but not enough to marry them. The middle tier, for the average games, will be called I Think We Should Just Be Friends. I'm going to call the second worst tier for games that are bad, I Think We Should See Other People, and then finally, for the worst games of the bunch, I'm Getting a Divorce. One could argue that a simple ABC tier system would be better and easier to understand, but easy to understand is not my style. Anyway, we've got 38 games to get through, although it's technically more than that. The point is, there are a lot of games to talk about, so we should crack on. I'll try to keep it brief, so I don't waste too much of your time. But before we go any further, I should warn you that the rest of this video is unscripted. So if it devolves into a mess of deranged madness, that's why. Good luck everyone, here we go. Alrighty, the first game I reviewed in 2024 was Crash Bandicoot 2 Entranced. Now when I talked about this game the first time, I was hypnotized into saying it was perfect and the best game of all time. I have double checked, and I'm pretty sure I'm in full control of my thoughts this time, so we should be good to go. Crash Bandicoot 2 Entranced was really, really good. Considering what it is, like it's a GBA adaptation of the classic Crash games, it's really impressive. Obviously it follows on from XS, which was the game before it, and it was very similar, but Entranced takes different level themes from the originals and adds in a few vehicles and a few other gimmicks sprinkled throughout the game, but overall it is an improvement over XS. It's kind of shocking how good it is. Like, you wouldn't expect a GBA game like this to be as good as it is. It's got really strong levels in it. Some are a bit weaker, like Coco's sort of space levels, they fucking suck. Like, she's got that little lifesaver ring and she's in space and she has to maneuver it to shoot at mines and things, and she's being chased by the sun, but the sun is behind you and you can't see it, so it's like the worst vehicle-based chase level in the history of humankind. But you know, there's some really strong levels in Entranced as well. One of them, Brock the Kasaba, made it into my top 10 best Crash Bandicoot levels. So, you know, it's home to one of the best levels in the whole series, which is pretty impressive. Yeah, Entranced was really, really good. It's got a few hiccups with some dodgy vehicles and levels that I'm not a fan of, but it's really, really strong across the board, so I reckon Wanna Go on a Date is a good place for it. It's not perfect, no matter what Entranced tries to hypnotize me into saying, but it is really good, so I think Wanna Go on a Date is a pretty fair spot for it. Next up was Spyro A Hero's Tale. A Hero's Tale was a bit of a weird one, because aside from the original trilogy and the Reignited trilogy, it's probably the best Spyro game. I reckon the only competition it would have would be Season of Flame on the GBA. But yeah, out of all of the Spyro games, A Hero's Tale is one of the stronger ones. That's not saying much, considering a lot of the shit that ended up in this series, but, you know, one of the best in the series. That said, as a standalone game, it isn't the greatest. I reckon when it's just playing as Spyro and it's just doing his regular thing, I think it's alright. It's not exactly close to the Spyro formula, it's more of a generic sort of platformer, which there's nothing wrong with that, you know, it's still fun to play, but it's just not... It lost a bit of that Spyro identity, which is, you know, points taken off for that, but it's still fine to play when you're just playing as Spyro. There is a lot of stuff in that game that isn't great. You know, you've got Blink, which is one of the worst playable characters in any game I've ever seen. You've also got Sergeant Bird's Speedways, you've got Sparks doing his little on-rails shooter thing, kind of like Star Fox, which is not that bad. Of all the extra playable characters, it's not one of the worst, we can say that. And this game does also allow you to play as Hunter, who is pretty fun to play as. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in this game that isn't really that good. I think the story is pretty lame. Like, Red, the evil dragon, is such a piss-weak villain. Like, who cares? No one feels threatened by this guy. He's just a big red Spyro. Like, what? There are so many better villain concepts you could have gone with. You chose a dragon who is red, and he's evil. Like, it's just such a disappointment in terms of, like, narrative and world building, you know? But, you know, beyond those sort of hiccups, Hero's Tale is pretty decent. It also is one of the best implementations of the elemental breaths that we've seen in this series, because so many games in this series do the elemental breath thing, and so many of them fuck it up. So it's good to see that Hero's Tale, you know, made it work somewhat. So I reckon Hero's Tale belongs in I Think We Should Just Be Friends, because it is mainly pretty good. When you're just playing as Spyro, I think it's really solid. When you start doing all of the extra shit with the extra playable characters and that little orb thing that's kind of like the Atlasphere from Crash, that thing is fucking shit. Like, that spits in the face of every ball-based game that exists. Whatever the hell that means. Yeah. So I think Hero's Tale's good stuff is good, but its weak stuff really holds it back. So I think the perfect middle ground, I think we should just be friends. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. Following that up was Gex. Now, when I played Gex for the review, I was kind of shocked because it wasn't anything like what I was expecting. My entry point to the Gex series was the third game, which I only played briefly as a child. I distinctly remember playing that Sherlock Holmes level and being petrified by a bear. And that's all I remember from that game. I didn't play any other Gex games because I was so scared of them. That was the only Gex experience I had. So when I went back to the first one and discovered that it wasn't even 3D, I was like, whoa, hang on, what's going on here? This was not what I was expecting. So Gex is instead a 2D platformer. And when you just look at it without really knowing what it is, it just looks like any other 2D platformer, but it is pretty special and pretty unique. This all comes down to how Gex plays as a character. Obviously he can do the standard run, jump, attack, you know, the holy trinity of 2D platforming characters, if you will. But Gex has the innate ability to cling to walls and ceilings, so he can just sort of climb up the level geometry and traverse the level that way. And that's something I've never seen before or since, really. It's really, really cool. It made for a lot of interesting platforming challenges. It made for some very difficult platforming challenges. It was just really interesting to play. I've not played anything else like it. Obviously, it was well presented. It has that unique Gex feel with all the TV themes, and it's got a great soundtrack as well. I wasn't as keen on the actual story because it's just Gex gets sucked into a TV and has to try and get out. And Gex as a character didn't really speak to me because he doesn't have his own personality. He's just sort of I was going to say wisecracking, but it's not even that. He's just a sort of reference generator, like he references pop culture, most of which I don't understand because I'm not from the US in the 80s and 90s. Like, I don't understand what he's got. Like, when he talks about Rush Limbaugh, I don't know what that is. Who's that? Is that an important person? I don't know what's he on about? Like, there are so many references he makes that just go over my head, so I find it really difficult to appreciate Gex as a character, specifically in this game. But, you know, beyond that, Gex is a really, really great game. It's not a masterpiece, it's not perfect, but it is really, really good and really interesting to play. I do wish it had a save system. Having to rely on passwords when I got a game over was quite annoying. But other than that, it was really, really good. So I reckon, want to go on a date? Pretty fair placing. Then we had Sonic Adventure. Sonic Adventure was a game I had played before I reviewed it, but it was not a game that I had finished before I reviewed it. And the reason is it just didn't really speak to me enough to warrant full completion. Like, I just got tired of it, basically, which is usually the sign of a bad game, but Sonic Adventure is not a bad game. When you're playing as Sonic, it's really, really good. I really like, the level design, how action-packed and fast they are. Sonic, obviously, with his speed, complements that level design quite well. I also liked playing as Knuckles. I just liked his whole scavenger hunt approach to levels. I thought it was really cool. But the other playable characters kind of... I was going to say ruin it. They don't ruin it, but they do harm the experience. Because there are 4 other playable characters. Tails, Amy, Big, and the other one, who is a robot, whose name I don't remember. And they all have different gameplay styles that are more restrictive than Sonic and Knuckles. Tails is alright, because he can kind of fly around, and he's still quite fast. But the other 3, Amy, Big, and the robot, are much slower, they're much more plodding around, and their levels are less interesting. And considering that, they make up 3 of the 6 playable characters, it's not half the game because they have fewer levels, but that's a pretty decent chunk of the game that's just not fun to play at all. I do like the idea of having 6 different characters have their own stories that interact and overlap with each other, but I think having 6 characters do that is a bit overboard, because it kind of gets really confusing, like how is this all, why are they all connected, what's this character doing here, why are they... It's just a lot, and it's kind of hard because it makes the story really disjointed and hard to follow. Maybe that's just me being a brain-dead moron, but I found it hard to really get into it because there was just too much going on. I didn't like the hub world system. I thought that also sort of ruined the flow of the gameplay, because every time you finished a level and you wanted to do the next one, you'd have to do some bullshit like find an elemental stone and carry it for 60 kilometers to this other area you've never been to before and do all this. It's just an annoying way of accessing levels that I don't think was done very well. The levels themselves are really good. Getting to them through the hub world was not. I think the soundtrack was really solid. The presentation was pretty good, even though some of the locations look kind of weird. It was that sort of odd phase where things look sort of high definition and realistic, but they're also very polygonal and strange looking. It was just a very unorthodox, uncanny valley sort of presentation style. But the music was really good. So yeah, Sonic Adventure overall, I think was pretty good and should go in Wanna Go on a Date. It would be higher if it wasn't for those annoying extra playable characters that I don't like, and also the hub world. Other than that, pretty good game. Then next up was Crash Nitro Kart. Nitro Kart was a bit of a controversial, well, it wasn't controversial, but it was a bit divisive in how people perceive it. I see it as a weaker version of Crash Team Racing, because that's just what it is. It's pretty much the same game, just slightly worse. Obviously, how much worse depends on what you value as a player. I personally value the track design and the racing controls more than anything else. And Nitro Kart is weaker in those departments. It tries to be similar and maintain the integrity of the original Crash Team Racing, but it just doesn't really pull it off. The drifting system is there, but it is different. Instead, it incentivizes you to constantly boost and try and get up like a chain. It also has this anti-gravity nonsense that is cool in theory, but doesn't always work. It's kind of awkward to control, and it doesn't always fit within the track design. A lot of the tracks do feel very similar to CTR tracks. You know, you look at Inferno Island, you look at Crash Cove, you can't tell the difference. It's that sort of thing. It's less inspiration and more stealing ideas. There are some original tracks that are actually quite cool, like Hyper Spaceway, specifically in this version of the game, is awesome. But the rest, it's hit and miss. The story of it is kind of insane, and I don't understand how they came to the idea of doing this intergalactic racing adventure. Like, it's a really odd leap to make, because it results in like half the cast of characters being original characters that no one's ever seen before and don't really feel like they belong. That's the sort of vibe that I got from Nitro Kart, is that this is all alien, because it's all alien stuff. It doesn't feel like it is from the same universe. It's a really bizarre sort of vibe. I do think it's a fun game still. It's just not as good as Crash Team Racing. If you're gonna play a racing game, I'm gonna say 99.9% of the time you're going to opt for Crash Team Racing over Crash Nitro Kart. So yeah, I think it's not a bad game, but it's not a great game. So I reckon I should put it in I think we should just be friends, because I still like it, but it's just not as good as Crash Team Racing. So it doesn't really have anything going for it. So I think we should just be friends is a fair spot for it. And then then we had Crash and Spyro Fusion. These games are shit. For a Crash and Spyro crossover, I could not think of anything worse that they could have done instead. This was such a poor display of what people wanted. Like, you're going to combine Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon? That's going to be awesome. It'll be the best platforming adventure we've ever seen. And what do? They make some bullshit mini-game compilation that's not fun for anyone. Crash Fusion was the one I did first. It is the better one of the two, and it's still not great. A lot of the mini-games, well, all of the mini-games are pretty shit. The only one I could see any value in is the sort of polar run-jump platforming thing, because it's the only thing that's sort of vaguely related to Crash Bandicoot, and I could imagine that being in one of the first two Crash GBA games. That wouldn't be out of place there. Everything else is fucking dog shit. Like, I just don't understand why you would decide to make this game. Like, it's just not good. Like, I'm struggling to comprehend what the development team was thinking. Like, was this just forced out by some fuck-ass executive that was like, oh, we need a quick cash grab, let's throw a bunch of shitty minigames together, slap Crash and Spyro in it, done. Millions and millions of dollars right there. Like, is that what happened? Like, I could not be more disappointed with a Crash and Spyro crossover than with these games. Spyro Fusion is even worse, because the minigames are even shittier. And it doesn't even have decent hub worlds. Like, Crash Fusion at least had hub worlds that were mildly interesting to platform in. Spyro Fusion doesn't have that. It's just a worse version of the same thing. I think it should be no surprise that it's going in the I'm getting a divorce tier, because it's just complete shit. It has no redeeming factors whatsoever, other than the fact that Crash and Spyro are both in it. Like, if it wasn't for that, these games would have been burnt at the stake by every gamer alive. Like, it would have no value in the world of video games at all. That's how bad they are. So, I'm getting a divorce is the perfect place for these two steaming piles of shit. So to wash the taste of diarrhea out of my mouth, I followed up Crash and Spyro Fusion with Bayonetta. Bayonetta is one of my favourite games of all time. It's not a platformer, so it was very out of character for me to review it at all, but I felt like it, okay? I'm allowed to do what I want, this is my channel. Bayonetta is a really, really, really fun game. It has some of the best combat in any game I've ever played. It's so just flexible, it flows really well, you can combo so many different moves together, there are so many different weapons, so many different tools you can use to just completely annihilate your opponents. You feel overpowered while playing as Bayonetta, which is something that not a lot of games manage to pull off while also being challenging. Like, Bayonetta is a hard game if you don't know what you're doing. But if a game makes your main character feel overpowered, it usually comes at the cost of the game being very easy. But Bayonetta doesn't fall into that trap. It's difficult, but you still feel overpowered anyway. It has a great presentation. I love the sort of animations and that little cutscene style that they do, where it has like the film reel and you can see like different images and things in the background and still images from cutscene. It's kind of not really that impressive technologically, but it is still nice to look at. Yeah, it's just a really, really fun game. It has great music as well. Holy shit. It has some of the best music in any game ever. So yeah, very hard to fault. The story is kind of weird. Like, it's not very clear what's going on at any given moment. Things just sort of happen and you're expected to roll with it. There is a story, and if you pay close attention, it will make sense. But a lot of people don't do that, let's be honest. People just play the game to see our ass, because that's what people are like. But not me. I play it for the story, which is not very good. No, the story's fine. It's just a bit disjointed and strange. Like, it's not told in a way that makes sense. You get what I mean. The point is, the game is very, very fun and hard to fault. So I reckon Will You Marry Me is the perfect place for it. Next on the chopping block was Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Now, I didn't know that this game was so negatively received by a lot of people. It baffles me as to why, because I know it's a Banjo-Kazooie game, but it's nothing like Banjo-Kazooie, and that would set off the fans. Like, I get that, but to say that the game is outright bad, I don't buy that. How could you hate this? Like, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is such a unique and interesting concept for a game, and I think it works really well. The game is vehicle-based, but the main appeal is that you can assemble vehicle parts and tools and utilities and all this stuff to make your own vehicles to approach certain challenges with. And that really was unlike anything else I've ever done in a game. Like, the only other game I can think of that's sort of similar is Tears of the Kingdom, and that didn't come for well over a decade later. So the fact that Nuts and Bolts did this way before, and is still one of a kind, I guess, is really, really something special. I remember sitting in the, what's it called? Mumbo's Motors, that's what it's called. Coming up with all sorts of wacky ideas for vehicles, things like, little cages that you can drop from the sky to land on people, big sort of tank silo things you could just drop onto things you're trying to defend. I remember making this enormous sort of helicopter thing that would push these floating orbs down in the air and allow me to get them into a certain space. There was just so many weird, wacky vehicles I ended up coming up with, and it was just a lot of fun doing it. I would play this game all over again just to make new, weird, wacky vehicles, because it was just a lot of fun. As far as the actual gameplay itself, it really does depend on how good your vehicle is, but sometimes you are forced to use vehicles that the game makes, and those are sort of less interesting. I'm not really into that as much, because then it's just a vehicle level. And when you sort of realize that, you sort of realize that the whole game technically is vehicle levels, and you don't do a lot of actual platforming, you just sort of drive around in different ways. But the thrill of the game is making your own vehicles and watching them either fail or succeed. And that's where I find value in this game, and I thought it was a lot of fun. So, while it isn't perfect because it has some issues, I also remember the load times being quite bad. But while the gameplay in and of itself isn't the most interesting, the freedom it grants you to make your own vehicles makes it one of a kind and a very fun game. So I reckon Wanna Go on a Date is a pretty good place for this. Then I did Crash Twinsanity. Crash Twinsanity was a bit of a weird one when I was talking about it, because it sort of highlighted or revealed to me, I guess, that a game's quality is not indicative of its enjoyability. A game can be, on a technical game design level, quite rough and still be enjoyable, and lifted up by its presentation and personality. And Crash Twinsanity is one of those examples, because gameplay-wise, it is a bit on the weaker side. It isn't anything... it's not terrible. Like, when you're just playing as Crash, it's fine. The, co-op between Crash and Cortex is pretty cool. Playing as Nina is fun. Playing as Cortex is not. The gameplay in and of itself is, at best, pretty alright. But the thing that elevates Crash Twinsanity to the next level is its personality and sense of humor. Because it's just such a charming, endearing game. Like, you can't help but enjoy it. Like, even if you're not on board with the gameplay because it's just not as good as, the other Crash games or any other platformers out there, you can still enjoy it because of its personality and sense of humor. And that's a really important lesson for games to learn, is that it doesn't all have to be about game. Because look, if a game has really, really, really fun gameplay, but the way it's presented to you is like, oh, you're playing as this like sort of grey cube through a bland, colorless environment, and all you do is sort of jump around. Like, it could be really well-designed platforming gameplay, but there's no personality, there's no soul, it's just a little cube doing jumps in a featureless environment. Like, you want a story, you want characters, you want music, you want a sense of humor, you want personality. That's what you want in a game alongside really good gameplay. And while Crash Twinsanity doesn't have the best gameplay, it has all of the rest of that stuff, and that takes it to the next level. And speaking of music, by the way, the soundtrack is entirely a cappella. That's really, really cool. It's not really something I've seen before or since. Sort of Tag Team Racing did sort of try to do that in a sort of hybrid with regular instruments sort of way, and it's just not as good. But here in Crash Twinsanity, I think it's really unique and really cool. So yeah, overall, Crash Twinsanity, really solid game. Want to go on a date? I think that's a pretty good place for it. It's not the best game. Some people would put it in Will You Marry Me because they just love it that much, and I could understand that, but, you know, the gameplay is not good enough for it to be that high, so I reckon Want to Go on a Date, pretty fair choice. Up next was Spyro Shadow Legacy. The short version of my review of this game is, fuck this game, it's the worst game in the series. And I stand by that. It's even worse than Spyro Fusion. Spyro Shadow Legacy just does not have anything going for it. In terms of its gameplay, it's nothing like any of the other Spyro games. It's this sort of RPG, beat-em-up sort of exploration game where you just sort of wander around killing enemies and getting XP for that, and rescuing, in quotation marks, rescuing civilians from different towns by defeating those enemies, and then you get, like, points, and you spend the points on new moves that help you do more combat, and it's a very repetitive, very boring, very bleak, uninteresting game. Like, even the presentation, I just don't care. There's barely any decent music. The locations are all quite boring to look at. I mean, they're nicely sort of drawn, I guess, but they don't feel like actual locations. The whole game is just repetitive and boring. There's nothing fun about it. The story sucks shit. Like, it's just not... Like, who cares? Like, I don't even know what it's trying to be. Is it trying to be an RPG? Is it trying to be a beat-em-up? What's it trying to... It's certainly not trying to be Spyro, because it's abandoned anything that resembles traditional Spyro gameplay. So what are we left with? This beat-em-up RPG shit? Like, I don't understand what they were thinking when they made this game. And it's not like it gets better, because every single level, in quotations, level, is the same thing. You reach a new location, that location is infested with shadow creatures, Spyro kills them, rescues the people, and then moves on to the next one. And it's just not interesting at all. Like, you get the full experience of the game playing the tutorial, because it doesn't ever change beyond that. And it's just so boring. Like, at least with Spyro Fusion, there's something to do. You're doing stuff. It's not great stuff, but I can imagine someone potentially having fun with some of those minigames. Shadow Legacy, I don't think you can have fun with this. Like, there's nothing happening that's interesting at all. So, without question, it's the worst game in the series, and without question, it's going in I'm getting a divorce, because it's fucking shit. After that disgusting travesty, I decided to play Wii Sports, because I felt like it. Wii Sports was an interesting one to talk about because it's obviously a very popular game. It's, I think, one of the highest selling games of all time, mainly because it came bundled with the Wii, but you know, that still counts. And it was really interesting to talk about because it was one of the first games to utilize motion controls in this way, and it was very innovative and interesting to look at how things went in those early days. I think 3 out of the 5/5 of the game are really strong. Tennis is really good, baseball is really good, and obviously bowling is the king of them all. They make really good use of the motion controls, they're very fun. They're the classic games you play with your friends on party night, or, you know, your family's got nothing to do in the evening. Fuck it, let's play some Wii Sports. And the ones you always go for are tennis, baseball, and bowling. The other two, golf and boxing. Golf is alright, but it's sort of more of a thing you would do on your own, because like no one wants to sit through bloody 18 holes of golf, you know, when there are so many better sports you could be playing on Wii Sports. No one's going to want to do that. Boxing is bad. mainly because it relies on the nunchuck. Mine, of course, it didn't work, so I only had one hand to to box with, which put me at an immediate disadvantage. But yeah, even if the nunchuck had worked, I don't think boxing would have been made any better. It just wasn't very interesting as a gameplay experience. Obviously, Wii Sports is also full of the little challenge training modes, which are very interesting and put a different spin on the main 5 gameplay styles, which I did enjoy. It was a very fun game. It's a very interesting game to talk about because of its pure reliance on motion controls. I would say the only thing wrong with it is that it is lacking in a variety, because it is only the 5 sports. That's all they've got. And it would have been nice to see more. Unfortunately, that's not how it worked out, because they only had the 5. And look, I understand it was one of the first games to do this, so obviously they were just testing the waters with it. They didn't want to go overboard. I get it. But it still would have benefited from some more variety. But overall, it's a really, really fun game, especially to play with friends. So I reckon, want to go on a date? Perfect spot for it. Then I played Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. I had a bit of history with this game before I played it for the review. I initially played this game as Sly Raccoon, which is what it was known in PAL regions as. I played it on a demo disc in the UK, and I was hooked after that. So when I got home from that holiday, I ended up buying all of the Sly Cooper games that were available at the time, and got stuck in, and it was an amazing experience. And for the review, I learned that hadn't changed. I was right to think that. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus is a very, very good game. It's simple and straightforward, but it's very interesting and fun to play. It's a linear platformer, which is unlike the other Sly Cooper games, which one of them I'll get to. But it is still focused on stealth and avoiding being seen by enemies and searchlights and lasers and all that stuff. So it puts a different sort of spin on your classic 3D platforming. And it was really fun. Sly is very fun to play as. He has a lot of moves at his disposal, and the levels are built around them really well. There are some gimmicks that I'm not a fan of, some vehicles, a lot of turrets. I don't know what the obsession with turrets was. There was a lot of that going on. The races with Murray in the van also weren't that great. I would have preferred just more levels as Sly, because that was, the highlight of the game. But yeah, overall, a really, really fun game with a good story as well. The Fiendish Five having their own, solo operations and then collaborating to steal the Thievius Raccoonus pages, and then Sly going out to get them back and restore his name, I guess, is what he was doing. It was really interesting and really cool, because normally, like in platformers, the boss characters don't have much of a backstory. They're just sort of evil, and the main character has to stop them, and there's no real reason behind why they're doing what they're doing, because they're not really doing anything. They're just evil and existing, and that's enough for the main character to hunt them down and slaughter them like dogs. But yeah, in this game and the series going forward, the boss characters have backstories and they interact with each other, and there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of, they're connected, and I think that's really cool, and I really wish more games would do that sort of thing. But yeah, overall, Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus, amazing game, well presented, a lot of fun to play, just has so much going for it. So I reckon, Will You Marry Me? Who's surprised? Following that up was Crash Tag Team Racing. I don't like this game. I get that it has its fans, but I just don't. I'm not on board with it. It's not so offensively terrible that I think it should be outlawed in all regions of the world, but it's just not great. It was hampered by the fact that I played it genuinely on genuine hardware, which meant that I used the GameCube controller, and I fucking hate the GameCube controller, so that did get in the way of my enjoyment a little bit. But even if I was doing it with a different controller on a different platform, I don't think my opinion of it would be any better, because it just doesn't have a whole lot going for it. It's Crash Tag Team Racing. Racing is the selling point. The racing is fucking shit. The tracks are incredibly boring with no hazards or any meaningful shortcuts or anything. The high-octane nature of the racing is nowhere to be seen. The only way to make racing exciting is by shooting at your fellow racers. And that in itself just trivializes the whole racing aspect of the game, because what you can do is you can latch on to another racer, shoot all the other ones, and then right as you're about to cross the finish line on the final lap, you disconnect from the person you've hijacked, and then zoom in front of them, and then win the race, and that's it. And there's no possible way you can lose if you do that. It just trivializes the whole thing, and it makes it so boring to play. But even if you try to play it normally, it's not fun because there's nothing going on. So it's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. There is another half of the game, which is platforming and exploring around hub worlds. And while that is kind of cool to see in a racing game, it's still, it's kind of still not interesting. Like, yeah, I get interacting with the environment and finding all the dioramas and stuff could be fun, and completing objectives like finding items for specific characters and unlocking costumes and all that. Like, there is an element of enjoyability in that, but there are only like 5 hub worlds that you can explore, and they're not that interesting. Like, there's not like a challenge to them. They're sort of not, they don't flow, well, they do flow, I guess. They're kind of open, so there's no real direction to them. I guess that's what I mean. I don't know, tag team racing just doesn't have a lot going for it. It has some mini games that are kind of fun for a few seconds, but I don't think this is a very good game. So I think I'm going to put it in, I think we should see other people. Like, maybe if the racing had improved and if there was a bit less, well, no, they shouldn't have less of anything because what's there is already bare enough. If there was more interesting track design and more of a focus on the racing part of the game, I think it could be knocked a tier higher, but it's just not at that level. So I think we should see other people is a fitting position for Crash Tag Team Racing. Then I moved on to The Legend of Spyro A New Beginning. And it was a new beginning. It was the new beginning of a new era in the world of Spyro. And I gotta say, I don't think it was a very good idea. The Legend of Spyro as a whole is pretty weak, but I'm gonna get to the other games when I get to them. A New Beginning was my introduction to this era of Spyro, and I was not that impressed. The gameplay was very repetitive. It's gone from, your more traditional Spyro with your platforming and your collecting of your items. It went from that to combat, and combat is basically the only thing you do in this game. And, it can be interesting to experiment with the elemental breaths. I personally think this is the best use of the elemental breaths that the series has ever done, specifically a New Beginnings version of them, because they're kind of fun to muck around with. Like, I like using the electric breath to fling enemies off of ledges. I like using the earth breath to completely decimate enemies with them having no chance of surviving, and all you have to do is sit there and watch them get sucked up in that tornado. That's kind of cool, but eventually that novelty does wear off, and you're left with very mundane, repetitive combat in very mundane, boring levels. And there aren't even that many levels. There are like 6, I think, and they're all just the same thing. You do a bunch of combat, you walk around for a bit, you get stuck in another combat thing, you kill the enemies, then you continue, you walk on for a bit more, and then you're introduced to more combat. And it's not like the combat is diverse, like it's the same enemies every time, it's the same moves, you only have one combo, like there's not a lot of flexibility with how you approach the combat. It's very, very repetitive. And that ultimately hurts the experience, because once you're done the first couple of levels, you've kind of seen everything the game has to offer. It doesn't get any better than that. I guess it does once you unlock the Earth Breath, and that's fun to fuck around with. But that's not enough to warrant, continuing the game. I did think, because I hadn't played Eternal Night or Dawn of the Dragon at this point, so when I was reviewing it, I didn't think it had potential. I thought, if they expanded on it in the right ways, it could be something really interesting and cool. But as it is a flawed game, and I stand by that. I don't think, there's a lot of room for improvement, and it's a decent enough foundation, but it is kind of on the weaker side. So I think I should put it in, I think we should see other people. This is a game that had potential, and it laid a foundation. It is up to the rest of the Legend of Spyro series to make the most of it. But A New Beginning, on its own, I think we should see other people. Next up was Super Mario Sunshine. This was the follow-up to Super Mario 64, which was a game that I did not like, and I had a lot of issues with it, and I was hoping when I went into Super Mario Sunshine that it would fix a lot of those issues. One thing it did polish up was the level design. In 64, I wasn't really a fan of the levels. They didn't really feel like anything. They felt very messy and incoherent. They felt like, when you're in primary school and you have those like little wooden blocks that are sort of different shapes and you use them to make patterns and tessellations and build stuff with them. They felt like if you dumped out a container of those little blocks and turned the pile of random shapes into a level, that's what 64's levels feel like. They just feel like a random assortment of... I should have just said that. They feel like a random assortment of shapes. That makes so much more sense than the random analogy I just threw in there. Whatever. The levels in Sunshine feel very polished. They feel like actual locations, and they were fun to explore. And speaking of exploration, controlling Mario was pretty fun as well. He retained most of the moves he had in 64, but he had the addition of the Flood Machine, which made his gameplay more interesting. He could hover about with his water, he could spray things. It made for a lot of interesting gameplay moments. But there were, unfortunately, things that were wrong with 64 that Sunshine carried on, kicking you out of a level after you die, kicking you out of a level after you collect a star. That sort of thing I just find really annoying. Like, it pisses me off. Like, especially for Sunshine, there's no reason for them to do that. Like, what's the point? Like, I guess if you're selecting a different star, you might need to change some level elements, but kicking you out after a death, what's the point? Like, I just don't understand. And there was also, and I carried on about it in the review, every time you left a level or you entered a new location, you would be shown this cutscene of a thing that's happening in Delfino Plaza. And it's like, you don't need to keep showing me the same thing over and over again, especially when you boot me out of a level because I've died. You don't need to show me... The example I used in the video was the Pillar of Light cutscene. I saw that at least 35 times. It was ridiculous. We don't need to see it every time. Just show us once and we get it, you know? Yeah, Super Mario Sunshine didn't fix all the issues, but it fixed a lot of them. That said, it wasn't as impressive as I was expecting it to be. You know, people harp on about the 3D Mario games as being some of the best games ever, and they just, up until this point, they haven't been. I know Odyssey gets really good because I have played that before, but 64 and Sunshine just weren't as good as I was expecting. It's still pretty good, but, you know, there's a lot that holds it back. So I think we should just be friends. That's where I feel like it should go. I was considering want to go on a date, but I don't think it's that good. I think it's a little bit lower than that, so I think we should just be friends. I feel like that's a fair spot for Super Mario Sunshine. Following that was Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest. This was a game that I played for the first time for the review, but out of all of the games that I've played for the first time for a review, Donkey Kong Country 2 is the only one that I've gone back to in my spare time to just play for fun. In fact, I even went as far as 102% completing the thing, getting all of the DK tokens and doing all of the bonus levels and all of that stuff. I did all of it. And it was really, really fun. I really, really loved this game. I think it's amazing. The platforming is really fun. It's really difficult. Playing as both Diddy and Dixie is really fun. They have great movement and they just feel really good to play. The levels are well designed. They're really creative. Some of the secrets in them are a bit bullshit. Like, there's just... Sometimes I think there's no way you'd ever be able to figure it out on your own. I mean, I did. I didn't look at a guide at any point, but there was a lot of trial and error involved, looking for areas where there might be something off screen or walls that might be fake or that sort of thing. You know, there's a lot of secret stuff going on in this game. But I just loved it. It's really difficult, it's really fun, it's really challenging, it's well presented. Oh my god, the presentation. It looks great, but the music, fuck me. This is one of the best game soundtracks out there. Like, there's just so many good songs that get stuck in your head and they just wash over you in a wave of ecstasy. It's brilliant. Yeah, I don't really have anything negative to say, so will you marry me? Like, there's no question about it. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, Crash Boom Bang. This game fucking sucks. what is it with the Crash games and party games being so bad? Like, the best party game in the series up until this point has been Crash Bash, and that game is bad. But Boom Bang is significantly worse. In fact, I'm pretty sure I called it the worst game in the series, and there's a good reason for that. Crash Boom Bang is sort of I guess it's a Mario Party ripoff, but just much, much worse. It involves rolling dice and exploring the board, but the board has this sort of objective thing where you have a goal that the four of you need to complete, rather than just trying to get the most stars by the end of the, turn count. You're supposed to complete the objective by finding items and reaching a certain spot or that sort of thing. It's just really bizarre in how it's laid out. The mini games are really, really shit. Like, I don't think there's a single good one in the whole game. Like, it's just painful. And what's even more painful is sometimes you have to spectate. Like, you don't even get to partake in the minigame. You just watch the CPUs fight each other in whatever minigame it is, and you just have to watch it happen. It's just really, really shitty. Like, it doesn't have any redeeming qualities. The story is stupid. The characters they don't even look like themselves, really. Like, look at Pura doesn't look like anything remotely related to the Pura that we know. Like, it's just ridiculous. Yeah. Like, I don't even think the presentation as a whole is that good. Like, it's very generic for a DS game. It's just bad all around. It's the worst game in the series. I don't think, Crash Fusion might rival it, but I'm pretty certain that Boom Bang is consistently worse. So I'm getting a divorce, and it can thank me for being so high in the list. Fuck you, Boom Bang. Piece of shit. The Legend of Spyro The Eternal Night. This was the game that followed up A New Beginning, so I had reasonably high expectations. I was hopeful, because A New Beginning set an alright foundation. There was a lot of room for improvement, and The Eternal Night squandered that opportunity. The Eternal Night, in fact, I think went backwards, because it's just less fun to play. The only major change that they made was the elemental breaths. They changed how they work, and they made them less fun to use. So it's the same as before, but now it's worse. Like, the whole structure of the game is the same. You wander through these levels for a bit, you do a bunch of combat, and then you keep wandering through, you do a bit more combat. It's just the same thing over and over again against the same enemies over and over again. It's just not anywhere near an improvement, or anywhere near the improvement I was hoping for. The story is worse. A New Beginning had an alright story. This one just doesn't make any sense at all. It starts off with Cinder running off, and then there's this whole interruption with these pirate things that don't have anything to do with anything, and then there's the confrontation with the King of the Apes at the end, whose name I can't remember. It's just a really bizarre mess of a story. I was really disappointed with The Eternal Night. I think out of all the Legend of Spyro games, this is the worst one. Initially, when I reviewed it, it was so frustrating and annoying to deal with that I just didn't even finish it. Like, I quit before I reached the end. I have since gone back and played it again on genuine hardware with the Wii, so I did it with motion controls. You can imagine how thrilled I was about that. But it just did not live up to any of my hopes. I was hoping that it would expand upon A New Beginning's formula and make it better, and it just didn't. It made it worse. I'm going to put it in I think we should see other people along with A New Beginning, but it's going to be on the lower end because it's just the same thing but worse. Then I played Rayman 3 HD, the version on the Xbox One. I'm always a bit hesitant when I talk about Rayman games because there's like 600 different versions of every game and they all have their differences. So I don't want to outright say that definitively a Rayman game is good or bad, because maybe the version I played was good, but the other versions of it are shit, and it stresses me out. But Rayman 3 HD, the version I played, was really good. It had a lot in common with Rayman 2, but I felt like it was an enhanced version of it, because it had some new additions, it had those powers, it had more interesting levels, it had a more interesting story, I guess, even though I hated Andre and the whole taking... Oh, what's his name? What's the frog's name? Glowbox! Taking Glowbox to all the different doctors to get Andre out of his stomach. It was just a really weird story, but I thought it was very well presented and the music was great, and it expanded on it in pretty good ways. The gameplay, I mean. yeah, it was really, really good. The only thing I didn't really like was the fact that it was so easy. Like, I hate it when games are easy because I feel like, I don't know, I'm not getting enough of an experience out of it. I want to be challenged. I want to be put through the ringer. And when a game doesn't do that, I feel a bit underwhelmed. That's nothing against the game itself. You know, it's just my fault for being so good at games. But, you know, I would have liked it to be a bit more challenging. But other than that, Rayman 3 was really, really good. So it wasn't perfect. So I'm going to put it in Wanna Go on a Date. But I cannot understate how much fun I had with it. I then played Shantaes Revenge. I really enjoy the Shantae series. I feel like it doesn't get enough recognition for how good it is. And Shantaes Revenge is a really good one. It took the foundation of the first game and innovated on it in some really cool ways. The big one that stands out to me was this, it's not really 3D, but it's this sort of multiple planes approach where you can jump forward towards the screen into a new plane or jump backwards away from the screen into a new plane. It just gives off this illusion of 3D and makes the world of Sequin Land feel bigger and more expansive and more fun to explore. The story was quite good, the presentation was great, I really loved the music in this game. It had a lot more life to it than the first game. Obviously the first game kind of struggled with that because it was a Game Boy Color game, but this one, since it was on the DS and ported onto the Switch, I mean they were all ported onto the Switch, but it started off as a DS game, had more room to explore with characters and animations and stuff, and the presentation and the characters and the story are a lot bouncier and more memorable in this game. It's a pleasure to look at, it's a pleasure to listen to. I liked meeting all the different barons, that was fun. Yeah, it's just a really good game. I felt like there was a lot more backtracking in this game than the first one, but that was sort of cancelled out by the convenience of the warp towers, of which there are quite a few. Yeah, I feel like this was a good second entry into the Shantae series. It was really, really fun, and I think Wanna Go on a Date is apt. Crash of the Titans. This is one of those games that's quite polarizing. Some people hate it, some people love it. I'm honestly kind of a bit of both. I think as a standalone game, it is pretty alright. I like it. Obviously, it's nothing like Crash at all, or what Crash had been up until this point. Instead of, you know, platforming and breaking crates and all that stuff, Crash of the Titans opts for combat and a focus on jacking titans and using their abilities to kill other titans. It is a very, very different approach to platform. I mean, there's still platforming in it, but it's very, very different, and there's a much greater emphasis on combat. I think it is fun. I did like it. I think it's well presented, but it's just not really a Crash game. The phrase that gets used very often when it comes to talking about this game is, it's a great game, but it's not a good Crash game, and I'm sort of inclined to agree with that. I think Crash of the Titans on its own is enjoyable, and I do like it, but in the greater context of the Crash series, it is one of the weaker entries, because it's just not anything like the rest of the series, really. And I think that does hurt the overall experience, because you expect it to be like Crash. Like, when you play it for the first time, you expect it to be like Crash. I remember when I played it for the first time, I was like, what is this? This is not what I was expecting at all. It just doesn't feel like a natural fit for the rest of the series. I'm gonna put it in I Think We Should Just Be Friends. I do think it is a decent game, but, you know, the fact that it's just not really Crash Bandicoot at its core does hurt it, so it can't go any higher than that. But I Think We Should Just Be Friends is a pretty fair tier for it. It's a solid, strong I Think We Should Just Be Friends. Then we had The Legend of Spyro Dawn of the Dragon. This was the Legend of Spyro's last chance to win me over. I held out hope that it would redeem the trilogy, and it did not. I do think it is the best of the three, but it just wasn't enough to redeem the whole trilogy. Dawn of the Dragon on its own is a pretty okay game. The thing that stood out to me the most was the free-flying mechanic. It was the first time in the series that Spyro was able to just fly whenever and wherever he wanted. And it was really cool. I did also like how Spyro and Cinder were chained together. That led to some really interesting puzzles and gameplay mechanics. But other than that, it just has the same issues that every other Legend of Spyro has, in that it's repetitive, combat-focused, not very interesting gameplay-wise. The story was probably the best one out of the three, in the fact that it rounds out the trilogy, it ends on a climax, it's the end. It gives you closure, which is not something I was really desperate for with The Legend of Spyro, but it was nice to have. But yeah, I just felt a little disappointed by it. It had the chance to redeem, because it was given to a different developer, so this other developer could have swooped in and redone the whole thing and been like, hey, this is what it should have been, this is a good Legend of Spyro game. And they sort of half did that with changes to how it all works, with the free-flying and the dual characters co-op thing. But it wasn't enough to save it. So I'm going to put it in, I think we should see other people. It's going above A New Beginning and Eternal Night, but not by much. It's still a very flawed game, and the whole trilogy is flawed, and I think it should wallow in its flawedness. Then we had Gex Enter the Gecko. This was more along the lines of what I expected from the Gex series, in that it was 3D. And I thought it was a very fun 3D platformer. It was quite simple, but it was effective. It had some cool level themes, it had some cool gameplay mechanics with Gex's spring jump. I liked that he could wear different costumes. I mean, it didn't have any impact on the gameplay, but it was just a neat touch to say, hey, I'm in a space level, I'm wearing a spaceship, or here I'm in a kung fu level, I'm wearing a kung fu outfit. I'm sure that has an actual name, but I'm just going to call it that. The thing that I thought was weird is that it did feel very similar to the first Gex game, which it really shouldn't, because the first Gex was 2D, so really it's nothing like this. But because it had similar level themes and similar music and a very similar story, it kind of felt like Gex Enter the Gecko was a 3D adaptation of the first game, which there's nothing wrong with that. It was still a lot of fun, but it just didn't feel like something new. It felt like I had done all this before. That said, I did really enjoy it. I thought it was a really fun game, and I think it's very worthy of going in, want to go on a date. It was a good game, I enjoyed it, not really much negative to say about it, so very solid. Then I played Ape Escape 2. Ape Escape 2, now that I think about it, is actually quite similar to Gex Enter the Gecko in that it feels very similar to the first game. Ape Escape 2 felt really like a clone of the first game, just updated for a new, more modern console. Not a lot had changed about it. It featured a lot of the same gadgets that function in the same way. The goal of the levels was exactly the same. The whole approach to the platforming in the game just generally was the same as the first game. The only major difference that I can recall was that there were a few more gadgets, and they weren't that groundbreaking, I suppose. They just felt like, more additions that could have been in the first game but just didn't make the cut. It felt very, very similar. The thing I did remember most as well is the boss characters being more interesting. I vividly remember that yellow monkey being absolutely disgusting. I think the villains were more memorable, but other than that, it just felt like the first game again. And look, the first game was great, so Ape Escape 2 by default is great too. I had a lot of fun with it. I was just kind of hoping for more of an emphasis on new gadgets or new gameplay or just more innovations, because the first game was really innovative. Like, there's no other game that I've played that's like it. It was very unique. So to see Ape Escape 2 make barely any effort to shake things up even more was a little disappointing, but it was still very fun. So I think Wanna Go on a Date is a very fitting place for Ape Escape 2. Crash Mind Over Mutant. Jesus. This game was overall a pretty massive downgrade over Crash of the Titans. There is one thing that Mind Over Mutant improved, and that was the Titans themselves. They were given the ability to jump, they were given more attacks to use, and they were able to be stored, so you could just take them anywhere. And that was a welcome addition that made them more usable, the Titans, I mean. It made it more interesting, there was more variety in the Titans you could use. It was just a welcome addition. But everything else, Mind Over Mutant just did worse. For example, levels and progression. Crash of the Titans was split into 20 episodes, each with a unique level that you only had to play through once, and it was very clear on how everything worked, where you were meant to go, how you were supposed to do things. Mind Over Mutant takes place in an overworld, and you just go over this map over and over again, going to different corners of it, and crossing over at familiar locations, and returning to locations, and backtracking and all this stuff to complete missions. And it just wasn't as good. Like, it's just more annoying to have to go back and forth through these areas you've gone through multiple times before. Like, this one bit This one bit in the Ratical Kingdom with this little T ice block with the switches you have to hit so it moves, and then that little sort of corkscrew bit where you have to follow the path and make it roll around so you can reach the other side. You go through that about 6 times, and honestly, it's ridiculous. You get sick of it. Like, the world of Mind Over Mutant is not interesting to explore. Other than that, like, the rest of the game is just, like, presentation-wise, it is sort of on a similar level, and obviously the cutscenes and the different animation styles help it to be memorable, but, like, presentation-wise, it doesn't do anything better than Crash of the Titans, so all that's left to say is that it's just a worse, more convoluted version of Crash of the Titans. So I think it should go in, I think we should see other people. Like, I'm not seeing any reason why it should be any higher than that. Then I played the Spyro Reignited trilogy, and I was over the moon to be able to play it after so much shit. I played through so many terrible games in the Spyro series. To finally get back to basics with the Reignited trilogy was a godsend. I was so happy to do it. The Reignited trilogy is basically the first 3 games, just updated with modern visuals and music. And also some quality of life changes, like sparks, being able to find gems that you haven't collected yet. Yeah, it was just the first 3 games, but slightly improved graphically with some quality of life changes. Like, the first 3 games in their original forms are fucking amazing. So having them remade, available on modern hardware with modern quality of life changes, with modern graphics, like, it's a no-brainer. It's going in Will You Marry Me? Like, there's nothing negative I can say. Well, the game did bug out a few times. Like, there's this one point in Stonehill where everything just sort of blacked out over the hills. That was quite gross. The monkey that floated away into the distance in Mystic Marsh. And there were a few others as well that I can't quite remember. I do talk about them in the review, but those sort of bugs were few and far between. The Spyro Reignited trilogy as a whole, amazing game, obviously goes in Will You Marry Me? I then played Sonic Adventure 2, which I thought was a massive improvement over Sonic Adventure, mainly because of how it was structured. Sonic Adventure was split into 6 separate stories, but Sonic Adventure 2 is only split into 2, in which there are sort of teams of 3 that you play as. So still same amount of playable characters, but a much less convoluted way of joining them all together. The game was very fun. I think the platforming generally had improved in terms of, like, level design, playable characters. They're all more fun to use. I really enjoyed Sonic and Shadow, they're very fast. Tails and Eggman with the mechs, I wasn't as big of a fan of, but they are very satisfying when you go around and you blow up a bunch of shit. That gives you a bit of a tingle in the underside, you know what I mean? Oh, you probably don't know what I mean. What do I mean by underside? What does that mean? Where did that come from? Anyway, Knuckles and Rouge are also very fun to play as, this sort of scavenger hunt. I said it before with Sonic Adventure, I love the scavenger hunt aspect, though they are slightly worse because the emerald piece indicator only works for 1 emerald at a time, whereas in Sonic Adventure, all of them worked at the same time, so you could go for them in any order. But you can't do that in Sonic Adventure 2, which kind of sucks. But, you know, overall, a very fun game. Very good story as well, very well presented with some great music. Loved it. It's not perfect, there's room for improvement, but I think it's a very solid, wanna-go-on-a-date tier game. It's very, very fun. Sly 2 Band of Thieves was up next, and honestly this game was a ripper from start to finish. It sort of abandoned the first game's approach, where it was divided up into separate levels that took place in unique environments, and it removed the whole linear approach. This game instead goes for a more open thing, with each episode having its own open levels, filled with missions that take place in those levels. And it was just a lot of fun. There was a lot of variety, there was so many different missions. The layouts of the levels were really cool and fun to explore, made very good use of Sly's abilities. You also got to play as Bentley and Murray, which added in some more variety. There was just a lot to enjoy. The story is great, like I said with the first Sly game, the bosses having their backstories and all interacting with each other. Sorry, I had a bit of a stroke there. It was just really cool to see. Very well presented, the music was great, the locations are very interesting. I just can't think of anything bad about this game, so I'm going to put it in Will You Marry Me? It more than deserves to be there. Then I played the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane trilogy. Honestly, this is in pretty much the same boat as Spyro Reignited, where it just took 3 fantastic original games, improved them with more modern visuals and music, and updated them with quality of life changes. This was particularly apparent in the first game, which really needed some help. It changed how the gems work and how deaths affect your ability to collect them. It added time trials to the first and second game, it allowed you to play as Coco. It was just the same games that we loved from our childhood, updated with more features and quality of life changes. I can't really think of anything bad about this game either, so it's also going in Will You Marry Me? Next up was Futurama. I had a bit of a history with this game before I reviewed it, in that it was sort of a lost relic of my childhood that I never got to finish beyond the second level because I was so petrified of it. Finally, getting my hands on it, I was able to play it all the way through, and it was a disappointment. The only good thing that Futurama has going for it is that it is Futurama. It has the characters, it has the sense of humor, it has the personality, it has the presentation style of Futurama, and that's the only thing that I like about this game. It's the reason I enjoyed it to any extent, because the gameplay honestly isn't that great. Fry is probably the best playable character with his gunplay. It's just the easiest to enjoy. Bender and Leela are less capable and have less at their disposal. They're more sort of platforming and combat focused, which just isn't really that fun to do in this game. And they have less interesting levels as well. Yeah, really, that's all I can say about it. The only good thing about Futurama the game is the fact that it's Futurama. If it weren't for that, this game would be shit. And it still isn't great even with the Futurama stuff, but the Futurama stuff definitely helps it. So I'm going to put it in I Think We Should See Other People. I love the fact that it's Futurama, but the game itself is bad. I then played Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. I really enjoyed the first Luigi's Mansion when I played it last year, and Luigi's Mansion 2 I felt like was an improvement on that. It expanded on it in all the right ways. For example, instead of just having the one mansion, Luigi's Mansion 2 has 5, and they each feature different themes, some based around plants and water, some based around sand, some based around ice. There's a lot more variety. The game is more organized rather than just doing one thing after the other. You've got different missions, so each mansion has like 5 missions and then a boss, and then you move on to the next one. It just felt like a more organized experience that flowed a lot better. The objectives were clearer. It was just a much more focused and engaging experience. I loved the mansions. I loved the personalities of the ghosts. The ghosts really appealed to me in this one. In the first game, they were alright. I especially loved the main portrait ghosts. But in Luigi's Mansion 2, I really liked just watching the ghosts goof off, especially the green ones. So yeah, and the presentation generally was much better, obviously, because it's the HD version of a game that came much later than the first one. You're going to expect that. But it looks and sounds really great, and this is just a really great game overall. So I'm going to put it in Want to Go on a Date? There is room for improvement, but it's a very solid game. Then we had Crash Team Racing Nitro Fuel. This is another incredible remake of an incredible original game. Remaking, of course, the first Crash Team Racing. It would have been, I imagine, very hard to improve the driving mechanics of the original, but they managed to pull it off. They improved on it in the right ways. For example, they changed the... I think it's called Sacred Fire mechanic, where when you boost after reaching high speed, you lose that speed. But in Nitro Fuel, they made it so that you can continue to carry it on. And it leads to some really high-octane gameplay. You can go really fast on some tracks. It's just incredible. Obviously, Nitro Fuel added so much more content than they needed to, with Nitro Kart tracks, bonus tracks, all this customization items, the Grand Prix. They did so much more than they ever needed to. And it was just amazing. From the entirety of the game's lifespan, it was just incredible. The only thing wrong with the game is, of course, the grindy nature of buying everything from the pit stop, and also the really rocky online mode that doesn't always work. It's very inconsistent and can be very tough to actually find a stable match that will work. And then also the loading times are quite bad. But other than that, Nitro Fuel is fucking fantastic. Like, it's one of the best games I've ever played. I just enjoyed it so much. So without question, Will You Marry Me? Then for Halloween, I played Medieval 2. I was really keen for this because I really loved the first Medieval. I thought it was really great with its atmosphere and its charm and personality. There was nothing quite like it. And the gameplay itself was pretty fun too. Medieval 2 definitely maintains the fun gameplay in the fact that controlling Sir Dan and using his weapons is still just as fun. But I think Medieval 2 is weaker on all the other fronts. The story isn't as good, the charm just isn't there, the personality is a bit weaker, and also I hate the fact that Sir Dan talks in full sentences. It's just disgusting and he shouldn't do it. He doesn't have a lower jaw, he shouldn't be able to do it. I don't think Medieval 2 is necessarily bad, it's just weaker than the first game, and I didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much. So I'm going to put it in I Think We Should Just Be Friends, because even though I thought the game was good, I just 100 times over would prefer to play the first Medieval. Following on from that was Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. This was the GBA game in the series, and I was a bit concerned going into it that it wouldn't be very good, but it actually surprised me with how well it managed to capture the essence of Banjo-Kazooie onto a Game Boy Advance. Like, that's very impressive. It is quite short. There are only 5 levels in the game, although I'll grant you my playtime was inflated by the fact that I couldn't find the 5 notes that was hidden behind the Jinjo statue in that one level, which is called Squatter's Harbour? Squelch's Harbour? Something Harbour. The point is, I couldn't find those 5 notes for at least an hour, or it felt like that long at least, so that definitely inflated my playtime. But it is a very short game besides that. It is also very easy, not that I expect vast amounts of challenge from the Banjo-Kazooie series. I did expect it to be a bit harder than what it was though. But yeah, even though it has some weak points, Grunty's Revenge did impress me with how well it managed to do for a GBA version of Banjo-Kazooie. I thought it was very impressive and I really enjoyed it. It was presented very well as well. It had some great music, it had some great level themes, even though the themes were ripped from other Banjo-Kazooie games, so they weren't completely original, but they were still cool to look at. So overall, I thought it was okay, had a lot of room for improvement, could have been a bit longer, had some more levels, just had more interesting missions as well, but overall it was pretty decent. So I'm going to put it in I Think We Should Just Be Friends. I think that's fair enough. Then I moved on to Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time. Now in the review I called it the best Crash Bandicoot game, so I reckon you can imagine where it's going to end up in this tier list. It just did everything right. It did exactly what it needed to do. It embraced the traditions of the Crash Bandicoot series and made a linear platformer that was very difficult, but also made the steps to innovate in the right ways by introducing the quantum masks and different movement options like running on walls and swinging from ropes and rail grinding and that sort of thing. It did all the things it needed to do. It has some great level themes with some excellent presentation, a gorgeous art style, some amazing music, a great story as well, which is not something that Crash Bandicoot games tend to excel in. It was just incredible from start to finish. The only thing wrong with it is that the 106% completion is a bit excessive and over the top, but I've done it, and it honestly wasn't that bad as everyone makes it out to be. I even did all the developer relics, and that was as bad as everyone makes it out to be, but I still did it, so it's manageable. I managed to do it. That means anyone can do it. But yeah, without question, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time more than deserves to be in Will You Marry Me, because it's just excellent. I then played Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Now this game had a very high bar to clear if it wanted to be better than the second game, and it did not clear it. Unfortunately, it just wasn't as good as the second game. Don't get me wrong, it was still great. I love that Dixie Kong was the main playable character. She is my favourite Kong to play as across the whole Donkey Kong Country series. I love how aerially flexible she is with a spinning ponytail, allowing her to glide through the air. That's really cool. But Kiddy Kong is much worse than Diddy Kong, and I just wasn't into this game as much as the second one. I thought that the level themes just weren't as interesting. They were still well designed, but they just weren't as visually or musically entrancing as they were in the second game. And it did have more of an emphasis on the story with some dialogue and some cutscenes, but it was just the same thing that the second game was. It just stole the same idea, but this time it's Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong who have been kidnapped, and now Dixie Kong has to save the day. Like, I don't know, it's just sort of like, yeah, been there, done that. Like, I'm not saying that Donkey Kong Country 3 is a bad game, because it's not. It's really, 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 really good. Well, it's not really, 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 really good, but it's really good, and I think it deserves to be praised, but it just isn't as good as the second game. So I'm not going to put it as high in the list. I'm going to put it in Wanna Go on a Date, because I think that's a fitting position for it. It's really good, just not as good as the second game. I then moved on to Super Mario Galaxy, which was fucking awesome. Way better than 64 and Sunshine, without question. It has a very unique approach to level design that I thought was really awesome. It focuses on sort of planets and orbits and messing with gravity, which is really cool. I've not seen levels designed in this way before, and I've not seen it since. mainly because it was only a few weeks ago that I played it. But yeah, it was really, really cool. I found it really interesting to explore these sorts of environments. Ultimately, the level environments themselves do suffer from being broken up into smaller planets and random objects floating in the vastness of space. That does sort of hurt the environment as a whole, but I still think it's a really cool level design concept and approach to the gameplay. It does make some improvements over 64 and Sunshine. Dying does not kick you out of a level, thank God. You still have to be kicked out when you collect a star so you can select a new one, but I'm willing to put up with that if it means I'm not kicked out for a death, because that's just the most annoying shit ever. The hub world is the least convoluted of all the 3D Mario hub worlds so far, which I'm really grateful for as well. It was just a really fun game. The presentation was great, the music was fucking awesome. I had no idea how amazing the music was gonna be. I didn't realize how much I would recognize from it, it's such a great soundtrack. But yeah, overall, Super Mario Galaxy, really, really fun game, even though I'm still terrified of space. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to put it in Wanna Go on a Date, because it was really, really fun. And now for the final game I reviewed in 2024, Crash Team Rumble, which, now that I think about it, was a pretty flat way to finish off the year, but you know what? It's too late, I can't take it back now. Crash Team Rumble is both good and bad at the same time. The good part is the gameplay. I love the concept. I love the idea of a competitive platformer where you go around collecting Wumpa Fruit to deposit it in your team's bank, or you defend the bank from other teams' scorers scoring, or going around causing mischief with gem pads and relic stations. It's just a really interesting, high-energy, hectic game to play, and I think it's a lot of fun. And also, there's a wide range of different characters with different abilities, so no two matches are the same, unless you're playing on the offline practice match mode, which is the only way to play offline, in which every opponent is either Crash or Coco, in which case, most matches will feel the same. But when you play with actual people, it's a pretty dynamic and ever-changing game. The bad stuff is all the stuff that surrounds it. First of all, no one seems to be playing. Both normal matchmaking and party mode seem to be dead. The whole season battle pass thing, I hate that approach to games. It makes me think that the focus of the game is not the gameplay, and instead on meaningless cosmetic items that no one will see because no one's playing the game online, so it doesn't even matter in the end. It's just one of those things where all of the stuff that surrounds the gameplay makes it worse. It's kind of similar to Crash Bash in that way, because Crash Bash's minigames in isolation are quite fun, but the way the game is built around them is quite shit. Crash Team Rumble is sort of bad in a similar way, in that the gameplay is good, but the way the game is built around it sucks. I think it had a lot of potential, Crash Team Rumble. It had potential to be something really special, but ultimately it flopped and didn't do very well. I'm going to put it in I think we should just be friends, because the gameplay is good, but everything else just really drags the experience down and just makes it more of a hassle to play than anything else. So I think we should just be friends is a fair enough placing for the, at the present moment, final game of the series. Which kind of sucks. I really hope we get a new Crash game to sort of wash the taste of Rumble out of our mouths. Not that Rumble is bad, Rumble is fine. It's just not the best game in the series. And I would like to have another best game in the series come after it, if that's alright. Toys for Bob or whoever's developing the series now, if you're listening, make sure it's a good one. And there we go. Those were the games I reviewed in 2024, ranked against each other. Some were good, some were shit, some were in the middle. I'm exhausted. I've spent the last 4 hours talking about these games. This is normally the point where I would do an outro, but I simply cannot be bothered. Bye!